The road into the mountains was narrow and swallowed by trees, the kind that whispered when the wind moved through them just right. Locals said the woods had memories, that they could recall every sin ever buried beneath their roots. Somewhere past the last gas station, where the map turned blank and the air grew thick with mist, stood an old cabin that time had forgotten. It was there, hidden between ridges of pine and fog, that the strangest love story in Virginia's backcountry took place, one whispered about only when the night ran too long. They said she was barely 16 when she wore the white dress. Her name was Elsie Mae Harlan, pale as the morning frost, eyes wide like someone who had seen too much. The man beside her in that faded photograph wasn't a stranger. He was the one who had raised her, taught her to read, to hunt, to pray. The only men she ever knew. Some called him her father. Others called him something far worse. In the valley town of Dry Creek, no one spoke his name anymore. The old women would lower their voices when it came up, muttering that the forest kept what it wanted, and it had wanted them. Travelers who wandered too far up the ridge swore they heard laughter in the fog, the sound of wedding bells echoing faintly through the trees. On a wet autumn morning, a man passing through found a photograph nailed to an oak trunk, its edges blackened with mold. The image showed Elsie and the men she married, both staring at the camera with hollow eyes that didn't seem human anymore. Behind them, something blurred, a shape that didn't belong in the world of the living. That discovery would unravel a story buried for decades, a tale of obsession, bloodlines, and the kind of love that curdles into madness deep within the woods. Rain came down in sheets that night, hissing against the thick canopy of the Appalachian woods. The sound wasn't just rain, it was the whisper of the forest itself, old and alive, watching every step of the stranger who wandered into its heart. He had taken a wrong turn somewhere along the gravel path that wound like a scar through the mountains. His truck sputtered, its headlights barely cutting through the fog that clung to the trees like ghosts. There was no signal, no sound but the steady drumming on the roof and the distant groan of thunder rolling over the hills. Then, through the blur of rain, he saw it, a faint orange glow flickering between the trees, as if someone had lit a lantern in a place where no one should have been. He stepped out, boots sinking into the mud, breath steaming in the cold air. The woods felt wrong, too quiet beneath the rain. Branches creaked under the weight of the storm, and something unseen scurried through the brush. The glow grew brighter as he moved closer, revealing the outline of a small cabin half swallowed by ivy and rot. Its windows were boarded, except one that still flickered with the dying light of a kerosene lamp. He hesitated, thinking maybe someone lived there, some hermit or old farmer trying to survive off the grid. But the silence that came from within was unnatural, too still, too patient, like the woods were holding their breath. The door creaked open when he knocked, not by human hand but by the force of the wind that pushed it inward. The smell that spilled out was damp wood, smoke, and something faintly metallic beneath it, something that made his stomach twist. He called out, but his voice died quickly, swallowed by the walls. Inside, dust motes drifted in the air, dancing in the dim glow of the lantern. There were 2 chairs, one overturned, a rusted stove, and on the mantel, a framed photograph of a girl in a white dress standing beside a man in a dark suit. Their faces were faded, but even through the blur of time, there was something off about their expressions, too blank, too close, like the camera had captured something forbidden. Lightning flashed outside, lighting up the cabin in a sharp, white burst. For a split second, he thought he saw a figure standing near the back window, a pale outline that didn't move. When the thunder came, the shape was gone, leaving only the whisper of the storm and the low creak of the floorboards, as if someone else had just stepped closer behind him. The next morning, when the storm had passed and the valley roads steamed beneath the weak autumn sun, the men reached Dry Creek, a town that seemed forgotten by time. It was the kind of place where the houses leaned into the wind, and the people looked at strangers with quiet suspicion. He stopped at a small diner with peeling paint and a sign that buzzed faintly in the mist. The waitress behind the counter, a gray-haired woman with eyes too tired for her age, poured his coffee without asking. When he mentioned the cabin he'd found up the ridge, the entire diner seemed to freeze for a moment. Forks stopped mid-air, conversations cut off, and the radio playing softly in the corner fizzled into static, as though even the air didn't want to carry that name. The man asked if anyone lived up there anymore, and the woman just shook her head slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Ain't nobody been there for years," she said, her voice low. "Not since Elsie went missin'. The name hung heavy between them, carrying with it the kind of weight only small towns know, stories passed down, half-truths that no one dared confirm. Another old man sitting by the window muttered that Elsie was just a ghost story now, a warning to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. But the waitress's trembling hands betrayed something more than superstition. He asked who Elsie was, and that's when the whispers began. Some said she was an orphan raised by a man who wasn't her kin but treated her like blood. Others swore they were related, father and daughter, uncle and niece, no one was certain anymore. The older folks called her the Bride of the Ridge, though no one ever spoke of the wedding. One farmer said he saw her once, years ago, walking barefoot down by the creek in a torn white dress, her hair tangled and her face pale as moonlight. They found her footprints in the mud, but they led straight into the woods and vanished. The men listened, unease crawling through him like the damp chill that never left the town. He mentioned the photograph he'd seen inside the cabin, and that made the waitress drop her cup. The crash of shattering porcelain broke the silence, but no one dared look up. One of the older men finally said in a shaking voice that if he found that picture, then he'd stirred up something best left buried. The men didn't understand what they meant, not yet, but he could feel it, the weight of the forest pressing in even from miles away, the sense that the story of the girl named Elsie wasn't finished, only waiting to be found again. 2 days later, the men returned to the ridge, unable to shake the feeling that the cabin was calling him back. The townsfolk's warnings echoed in his mind, but curiosity had a hold on him stronger than fear. The woods were quieter this time, heavy with fog that blurred the edges of everything. Each step he took seemed to sink deeper into the earth, as though the ground itself wanted to keep him there. The air carried the faint scent of smoke and something older, wet soil and decay. He followed the same path that had led him to the cabin before, but now the forest seemed different, rearranged, like it had shifted overnight. Then, just off the trail, he saw something that made him stop cold. Pinned to the trunk of a rotting oak was an old photograph, warped and darkened by rain. The corners were curling, and the edges looked as though they had been burned. A single rusted nail held it in place, driven deep into the bark. He brushed the surface with his fingers, careful not to tear it, and beneath the layer of grime, faces began to emerge. A young woman stood beside an older man, both dressed in clothes that looked decades out of date. The bride's dress was tattered, the hem streaked with dirt, and her eyes, those hollow, unblinking eyes, seemed to follow him through the fog. The man beside her wore a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that looked more like possession than love. He felt the air grow colder around him as if the forest itself had taken notice. Somewhere far off, a crow let out a low, rasping call that broke the silence. He pulled the photo free from the tree, and a small piece of bark came with it, revealing another layer beneath, something carved into the wood. The letters were faint, nearly erased by time, but he could still make them out. Forever bound, the words sent a shiver crawling up his spine. As he turned the photograph over, he noticed faint writing on the back in a woman's delicate script. Most of it had been washed away, but 2 words remained, smeared yet still legible, "Help me." His heartbeat quickened as the wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a low, rhythmic murmur that almost sounded like breathing. He stuffed the photo into his jacket pocket, but the forest didn't seem to like that. Every sound grew sharper, the snapping of twigs, the shifting of branches above him, the echo of footsteps that weren't his own following close behind. The men didn't sleep that night. The photograph lay on the table beside his bed in the rundown motel at the edge of Dry Creek, and even in the dim light, he could feel the eyes in that picture watching him. The young woman's stare seemed to shift when the shadows moved, her expression no longer blank but pleading, while the older man beside her appeared almost proud, as if guarding her from the world, or keeping her trapped within it. The more he studied the photo, the more wrong it felt. The background showed the same cabin he had found, its porch sagging and its windows dark. Yet there was something else in the image, something barely visible at first glance. Behind them, half hidden in the tree lean, was a blurred figure, pale and shapeless, like a person standing just beyond the focus of the camera. He brought the photograph closer to the light and saw that the man's eyes weren't looking at the bride but slightly past her, toward the shadow behind them. The smile on his face seemed to stretch too wide, his hand gripping the girl's shoulder with an unsettling firmness. The more he stared, the more that hand began to look wrong, bony, tense, as if it wasn't resting but clutching. The woman's fingers were curled tightly around a small bouquet, though the flowers had darkened with age until they looked almost black. The whole scene was heavy with a feeling he couldn't name, something far older than the photograph itself. When he took the picture to the diner the next morning, the reaction was instant. The waitress went pale and refused to touch it. One of the older men by the window muttered that the man in the photo was Elijah Harlan, a name no one liked to say out loud. He had lived up on the ridge years ago, raising a girl who everyone thought was his adopted daughter. But whispers had started when she grew older, whispers that she wasn't adopted at all, that she was his by blood. The wedding, they said, wasn't a union but a curse, a defiance of nature that brought ruin to everyone who spoke of it. The man in the diner warned him that even carrying the picture was dangerous, that Elijah's spirit was known to linger wherever his name was spoken. That night, as the traveler drove back toward the ridge, the photograph resting on the seat beside him, a streak of lightning illuminated the forest ahead. For a split second, he saw the outline of two figures standing at the tree line, side by side, just like in the picture, waiting for him to come closer. As the men ventured deeper into the mountains the next evening, the fog seemed thicker, heavier, as though the woods were swallowing the light before it could touch the ground. He followed the narrow dirt path that twisted up toward the cabin, guided only by the faint beam of his flashlight. Every sound was sharper now, the rustle of branches, the distant hoot of an owl, the faint trickle of water from a hidden creek. Yet beneath those natural sounds, there was something else, a faint rhythm, almost like humming. The tune was soft, haunting, and though it came from no clear direction, it felt familiar, like something a child might have been taught long ago. He recognized it suddenly, the same melody that seemed to echo through the photograph in his mind, the one the bride must have heard on her wedding night. When he reached the clearing, the cabin looked older than before, its wood blackened with rot, its windows fogged from the inside. The door hung slightly open, creaking as it swayed in the cold wind. He hesitated before stepping inside, the beam of his flashlight catching dust swirling in the air. The smell of dampness and decay was stronger now, and beneath it lingered another faint scent, lavender, old and fading, like perfume left too long on a forgotten dress. On the table near the stove sat two plates, still set, as if waiting for someone who never returned. One had a small silver locket resting on it, the initials E.H. engraved faintly across its surface. He reached out and opened the locket. Inside was a photograph, tiny and worn, a baby girl wrapped in a blanket, and the same man from the wedding picture holding her close. His breath caught in his throat as realization began to take shape. The man hadn't just been her husband, he had once been her caretaker, the one who had raised her from infancy. The humming outside grew louder then, drifting through the broken window, and for a moment, it almost sounded like a woman's voice. He stepped toward the door, his heart pounding, but saw no one, only the trees swaying under the pale moonlight. He turned back toward the table, but something had changed. The plates were no longer empty. The locket was gone, and on one of the plates lay a withered bouquet of wildflowers, tied together with a faded white ribbon. The flowers looked exactly like the ones in the wedding photo, as if someone had just placed them there moments before he entered the room. The wind outside shifted again, carrying with it a whisper so soft it barely existed, yet clear enough for him to hear his name spoken by a voice that didn't belong to the living. The discovery of the locket left the man restless through the night. He stayed in his truck near the edge of the forest, staring into the darkness as though it might answer the questions circling his thoughts. The connection between the men in the photo, Elijah, and the girl, Elsie, was becoming clearer, but the truth behind it was worse than he wanted to admit. At dawn, he drove back into town, determined to find someone who could confirm what he had begun to suspect. The few locals who spoke to him avoided his gaze, muttering excuses or turning away the moment he mentioned the cabin. It wasn't until he stopped at an old general store on the edge of town that someone finally spoke. The man behind the counter, a hunched figure with thin white hair and sharp eyes, asked what had brought him so far into the ridge. When the traveler mentioned Elijah Harlan's name, the old man stiffened, his hand pausing halfway to the register. "Southwest you found his place," he said quietly, not as a question but a grim acknowledgement. He told the traveler that Elijah wasn't just a recluse, he had been a preacher once, before he turned to what the townsfolk called his own kind of scripture. They said Elijah claimed bloodlines were holy, that purity came not from strangers but from keeping the family whole, too whole. The old man's voice trembled as he spoke, his eyes darting toward the window as though the forest might be listening. When the traveler asked about the girl, the shopkeeper nodded slowly. "Elsie," he said, the name soft and broken. "She wasn't adopted like people said. She was his daughter by blood. And when her mother passed, he started saying God had chosen her to continue the line." The words hung between them, cold and heavy. The traveler felt a sickness rise in his chest, but before he could speak, the old man leaned closer and whispered that the two of them had lived like husband and wife for nearly a year before the girl disappeared. Some claimed she ran into the woods to escape him. Others believed he buried her there after she tried to defy him. No one ever proved it. The shopkeeper warned him to leave before dark, to forget what he'd seen and never go back to that cabin. But as the traveler stepped outside, the wind carried a faint melody again, the same tune he'd heard near the woods. It came from nowhere and everywhere, thin and sorrowful, and in that moment he knew he couldn't leave, not until he found out what really happened to Elsie Harlan. Later that afternoon, the traveler went searching for anyone who had known Elsie personally. Most of the older folks in Dry Creek avoided him entirely, shutting their doors when he asked questions or pretending not to hear. Finally, a woman at the edge of town told him about someone who might remember, the midwife who had delivered most of the children born in those mountains decades ago. Her name was Mabel Trout, and she lived alone in a small house beside an overgrown cemetery, where the weeds were taller than the gravestones. When he knocked on her door, she didn't answer right away. After a long pause, the latch lifted, and a frail, silver-haired woman appeared, her face pale and drawn, her eyes sharp with suspicion. He introduced himself and mentioned Elsie's name. At that, Mabel's hand trembled on the doorknob. She told him to come inside quickly, before anyone saw them talking. Her home smelled of dried herbs and smoke, and the walls were covered in old photographs, babies, families, black and white portraits yellowed with time. She sat down heavily in a creaking chair and said she'd sworn never to speak of that child again, but that her silence had haunted her for years. She remembered the night Elsie was born as if it had happened yesterday. It was a bitter winter, the roads buried under snow, and Elijah had brought his wife, Martha, to Mabel's door in the dead of night. The woman had been in agony, her screams muffled by the storm, and Mabel realized something wasn't right, not just with the birth, but with Elijah himself. He refused to leave the room during the delivery, pacing the floor, muttering strange prayers under his breath. When the baby finally came, he looked down at her with a kind of fervent awe, whispering that she was the chosen one. Mabel said she had seen love and grief in men's eyes before, but what she saw in his was something else, possession. Days after the birth, Elijah returned alone, saying Martha had fallen ill and died suddenly. He wouldn't let Mabel see the body, claiming she was already buried near the cabin. No death certificate was ever filed. As Mabel spoke, her eyes glistened with fear and guilt. She admitted that for years afterward, she'd hear strange rumors from the ridge, how Elijah never remarried, how he kept the girl isolated, teaching her things that no father should teach his daughter. Mabel's voice broke as she said she wished she'd gone up there to see for herself. Then she looked at the traveler and whispered that if he'd truly found the cabin, he should burn it to the ground before whatever lived there remembered him too. That night, the air over Dry Creek turned strange again. The fog crept down from the mountains like a living thing, swallowing the town in a gray silence. Most of the locals locked their doors early, drawing curtains tight as if to shut out something that waited just beyond the glass. The traveler sat in his truck on the outskirts, unable to shake the story Mabel had told him. Her trembling words replayed in his head, the storm, the birth, the death that followed. The more he tried to convince himself that it was just folklore, the more the woods seemed to whisper otherwise. He decided to drive back toward the ridge, his headlights cutting through the mist in narrow, ghostly beams. The higher he climbed, the darker it became until even the moonlight vanished behind the trees. When he reached the clearing, the cabin looked almost unreal, like it had grown out of the earth itself. The air was heavy with the smell of wet pine and smoke, though no fire burned in the chimney. Then he saw it, the faint flicker of light in the distance. At first, he thought it was lightning again, but it pulsed steadily, as though someone had lit a lantern deep in the forest. The glow moved, weaving between the trees, vanishing and reappearing as if leading him somewhere. He followed it cautiously, his boots crunching through the damp leaves. The further he went, the colder the air grew, until every breath came out in visible clouds. The light stopped near a cluster of trees where the ground dipped into a small hollow. He crouched low, watching, unsure if it was a trick of the fog. Then another light appeared beside it, and another, until half a dozen faint orbs floated in the darkness like candles in unseen hands. They hovered in silence, flickering softly, their reflections glowing faintly in the pools of rainwater scattered across the forest floor. He raised his flashlight, but the beam seemed weaker here, swallowed by the mist. When he took a step forward, the lights moved too, further back, deeper into the woods, as if beckoning him to follow. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the trees, and the lights vanished all at once, leaving him in perfect darkness. He stood frozen, the forest around him utterly still. Then came the faintest sound, a woman's laugh, low and echoing, carried by the wind. It was soft but close, and it felt as though it came from everywhere at once. When he turned back toward the path, a new light appeared behind him, glowing through the cabin window, steady and warm, like someone inside was waiting for him to return. By the time he reached the cabin again, the forest had gone deathly quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive, listening. The single light in the window flickered, throwing long, shivering shadows across the clearing. He stepped inside slowly, the wooden floor groaning beneath his boots. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, smoke, and something older, something that reminded him faintly of decay. The lantern on the table still burned, though he hadn't left it lit before. It took him a moment to notice what was different. The table had been cleared, the locket gone, the wildflowers missing. The sense of unease that had been following him since he first found the place began to harden into dread. He scanned the room, his flashlight beam landing on something new near the far wall, a faint line of disturbed dirt, stretching toward the back door. He followed it outside into the cold night. The moon had broken through the clouds, washing the clearing in a pale, silvery light. Behind the cabin, the ground was uneven, patches of turned soil standing out against the rest of the untouched forest floor. He crouched down and brushed away a layer of leaves, revealing the edge of something buried. It wasn't stone or wood, but metal, an old cross made from rusted iron, half sunk into the earth. Beneath it, a mound of dirt rose slightly higher than the rest. There was no name carved anywhere, just a single word scratched crudely into the metal, Mother. A chill passed through him as he realized what he was looking at. Mabel's story echoed in his head, Elijah bringing his wife's body back to the cabin after the birth, refusing to let anyone see her. The grave was small, too small for a grown woman, almost as if it had been dug in haste. He felt something soft under his boot and looked down to see a ribbon, faded white and fraying at the edges, half buried in the soil. He reached for it, and as his fingers brushed the dirt, the wind rose sharply, moaning through the trees. For a second, he could swear he heard a whisper beneath it, a woman's voice calling faintly, the sound drawn out like a sigh. He stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. The forest seemed to close in tighter, the shadows deepening around the grave. Then the lantern inside the cabin went out, leaving him in near total darkness. He could still see the outline of the iron cross glinting faintly in the moonlight, and for the briefest moment, he thought he saw movement just beneath the soil, a small tremor that rippled across the mound, as if something underneath had stirred in its sleep. He didn't sleep that night. The grave behind the cabin burned in his thoughts like a brand, every detail replaying in his mind, the crude cross, the ribbon, the faint movement beneath the soil. As dawn crept through the fog, he forced himself to go back inside the cabin. He needed to understand why it felt like the past hadn't stayed buried there. The air inside was colder than it should have been, even with the windows shut tight. Dust floated lazily through the weak gray light, settling on the table and the old wooden floorboards. Then he noticed something new, the corner of a leather-bound book sticking out from beneath a loose plank near the fireplace. He pried the board up and pulled it free, his hand shaking as he brushed off the dirt. It was a journal, old and brittle, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. The first entries were neat, written in strong handwriting that belonged to Elijah. They spoke of faith, family, and isolation, how he had come to the mountains to escape the corruption of the world. But as the entries continued, his words grew stranger, more fervent, full of biblical passages twisted into something darker. He wrote of purity in blood, of keeping the line unbroken, of divine unity between flesh and spirit. One passage stopped the traveler cold, "She will not be my daughter, for she is of me and from me. Our union will cleanse what the world has defiled." His throat tightened as he realized Elijah was speaking about Elsie. As he turned the pages, the handwriting began to change. The lines became uneven, jagged, desperate. The words no longer spoke of faith but of something consuming, obsessive. There were drawings, crude and childlike, sketches of the girl, always smiling, always beside him. Toward the middle of the book, another handwriting appeared, smaller, shakier. It was Elsie's. Her entries were brief at first, simple reflections of a lonely girl, days spent reading, gathering herbs, listening to her father preach. Then the tone shifted. Her words became frantic, her sentences breaking off mid-thought. She wrote of dreams that didn't feel like dreams, of whispers outside her window, of voices calling her name. One entry was smeared with tears or rain, the ink nearly gone except for one line, he says the blood makes us one, but the woods say otherwise. Asterisk. The traveler closed the journal with trembling hands. The silence around him felt heavier now, pressing in from the walls. Somewhere outside, a single knock echoed against the cabin door, slow and deliberate, as if something had been waiting for him to finish reading before it decided to come closer. The knock on the door faded into the steady hum of the wind, but the traveler didn't move. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. After a moment, he opened the door slowly, but there was nothing outside, only the fog rolling low across the ground, thick as smoke. The forest stood silent, unmoving, but he could feel it watching. When he turned back inside, his flashlight beam landed on the journal again, open to a page that hadn't been there before. The handwriting was Elijah's, his words scrawled in furious, jagged strokes as if written in a trance. The entry spoke of revelation, of a voice that had spoken to him from the woods. It told him that purity was not something given, it was something that had to be reclaimed. He wrote that God had chosen him to restore the sanctity of his bloodline, to undo the sins of the outsiders, and bind the sacred bond that was broken. The next few pages detailed a ritual, written in language that mixed prayer with obsession. He described preparing a ceremony under the full moon, one that would unite the beginning with the end. The words grew harder to read, smudged and violent, as if written in haste. In one entry, Elijah claimed that the child, Elsie, was not only his creation but also his salvation. He believed their blood shared the same divine spark and that their union would make them eternal. To him, she was not a daughter but a vessel meant to preserve what he saw as holy. His words painted a portrait of madness disguised as devotion, of a man so consumed by his twisted faith that he had blurred the line between sin and sanctity. The traveler's stomach turned as he read the passage describing the night of the ritual. Elijah wrote of firelight, hymns, and vows whispered in a language no church would claim. He wrote of Elsie's silence, her pale hands clutching wildflowers as he placed a ring on her finger. His words ended with a chilling certainty, asterisk, and so the blood was made whole again. Asterisk, the ink after that line was smeared as though written through tears, or blood. The traveler closed the book, feeling the cabin tilt around him, the air growing colder, tighter. He thought he heard footsteps above him, faint but deliberate, pacing slowly across the attic floor. The boards creaked once, twice, then stopped. He looked up, and the ceiling above him let out a low groan, like the weight of something unseen had just shifted its position and settled directly above where he stood. The sound from above faded, leaving only the slow creak of the house settling into silence again. The traveler waited, flashlight trembling in his hand, but nothing else moved. Finally, he climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, each step protesting beneath his weight. The air grew thicker as he ascended, heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. When he reached the top, he found the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open, and a thin beam of light from the moon filtered through a small, cracked window. The attic was cluttered with boxes, yellowed papers, and old furniture draped in sheets. But it was what stood in the far corner that made him stop breathing, a wooden cradle, empty but rocking ever so slightly, as though someone had just stepped away from it. He approached slowly, his flashlight trembling over the faded paint. A child's blanket lay folded inside, embroidered with the initials E.H. The sight sent a chill crawling up his spine. He lifted the blanket and found beneath it an old letter, folded neatly, the paper brittle with age. The handwriting was elegant but weak, written by a woman's hand. As he read, his throat tightened. The letter was addressed to no one, signed only with the name Martha. She wrote of her fear, of how Elijah had changed since they came to the mountains. She said he spoke of voices in the woods, of a divine plan that frightened her. She begged whoever might find the letter to take her daughter far away, to keep her safe from him. The last lines were written shakily, as though her strength was fading. She wrote that Elijah had become convinced that the child was more than human, that she carried the spirit of their ancestors, reborn through him. The night before she disappeared, she had heard him praying outside, repeating the same phrase again and again, asterisk, the blood must not be divided. Asterisk, the traveler lowered the letter, feeling the weight of what it meant. Martha hadn't died of illness like Elijah had claimed. She had known something was coming, something she couldn't stop. He shone his light across the room again and noticed dark stains on the floorboards near the cradle, faded but unmistakable. They led to a small trapdoor half hidden beneath a pile of boxes. He knelt and brushed away the dust, revealing the latch. As he pulled it open, a cold draft swept up from the darkness below, carrying the faintest scent of iron and something sweeter beneath it, something that might once have been perfume. From deep inside that hidden space came a whisper, so soft he almost missed it, a woman's voice, faint and trembling, saying the same word over and over, "Run." The traveler froze as the whisper echoed faintly through the dark opening, a trembling sound that didn't belong to the creaking of the old house or the sighing of the wind. It was a woman's voice, distant yet near, as if it were both beneath him and inside his own head. His breath caught in his throat. The flashlight beam quivered as he angled it down into the trapdoor's narrow shaft. What he saw was only blackness, a void so absolute it seemed to swallow the light whole. But as he leaned closer, the air grew colder, and he swore he could smell decay mixed with something floral, like old roses left too long in stagnant water. He hesitated, but curiosity tugged at him harder than fear. He lowered himself through the opening, his boots scraping against the wooden ladder until they touched dirt. The space below was cramped and damp, its walls made of stone that glistened with moisture. He turned slowly, sweeping the beam around until it landed on what looked like a small altar, carved roughly from the rock. Dried flowers were scattered around it, along with melted candles and bones, small ones, arranged in a circle. The sight twisted his stomach. Some of the bones still had scraps of fabric clinging to them, the remnants of what might have been a dress. On the wall behind the altar, someone had carved words deep into the stone. The traveler ran his fingers over them, tracing the uneven letters. It read, asterisk, her body is soil, but her spirit remains pure. Asterisk beneath it, there was a date, 1874, and a small handprint pressed into the rock, preserved as though sealed there during the ritual Elijah had written about. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that this was Martha's resting place, or at least what Elijah had intended it to be. But the whisper came again, this time stronger, rising and falling like a plea caught in the wind. It wasn't calling for help, it was warning him. Then, behind him, something shifted in the dark. He turned quickly, his light catching on a figure half hidden in the shadows. It wasn't moving, yet it stood upright, draped in what looked like a faded wedding dress. The veil hung low, and though he couldn't see the face beneath, he could sense the presence staring back at him. The temperature dropped sharply, frost began to creep along the stone walls, shimmering in his light. The traveler's breath came out in pale clouds, his heart pounding against his ribs. The whisper came one last time, now directly in his ear, as though someone stood right beside him, the same voice, soft and desperate, saying again, "Run before he wakes." The traveler stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering as the figure in the faded wedding dress remained perfectly still. For a heartbeat, the world seemed suspended in that cellar's suffocating silence. Then, without warning, the veil shifted, just slightly, as if stirred by a breath that didn't belong to him. He raised the light, forcing himself to look closer, and what he saw made the blood drain from his face. Beneath the veil wasn't a face at all but a mask of wax, melted and warped with time. The mouth was carved into a fixed smile, the kind that made it impossible to tell if it was meant to be kind or cruel. As he moved closer, the flashlight beam caught something glinting at the figure's chest, a locket, dull with age but still intact. He reached out with shaking hands and opened it. Inside were two tiny portraits painted on cracked glass. One was of Elijah, unmistakable even after all these years, the other was of a young girl with pale eyes and soft curls, Elsie. Underneath the portraits, a lock of real hair had been pressed flat, sealed there long ago. He felt a surge of nausea as he realized the truth. This wasn't just a figure. It was a body. And whoever had arranged it had done so with reverence, dressing it carefully, preserving it like a relic. He stepped back, his light sweeping across the room again, and noticed now that the walls weren't just rough stone, they were etched with markings. Circles, symbols, and phrases scrawled in both charcoal and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Each mark seemed to tell a story of devotion, but also of confinement. This wasn't a shrine to faith. It was a tomb built from obsession. The traveler's hand brushed against a small wooden box resting near the altar. Inside it were rings, dozens of them, each engraved with initials. Some were rusted, some still gleaming, but one stood out, a gold band marked with E+E. Before he could process what it meant, the wax mask cracked. The sound was sharp, brittle, and impossibly loud in the quiet. The traveler froze. Slowly, the figure's head tilted forward, the veil slipping slightly. Beneath it, a pale cheek appeared, not wax, not bone, but skin. It looked too soft, too untouched by decay. Then came a low hum, almost like a lullaby, vibrating through the cold air. The traveler staggered backward, his light shaking violently, when the whisper returned, not from behind him this time, but from the figure itself. The lips beneath the veil began to move, forming words too faint to understand, before ending in one that chilled him to the marrow, *bride*. The word bride hung in the air like a curse, echoing off the stone walls and sinking into the traveler's bones. He froze, his breath catching in his throat, unsure whether the voice had come from the figure or from somewhere deeper within the dark. His flashlight flickered again, dimming as if the air itself was draining its strength. The figure in the veil swayed slightly, the wedding dress whispering against the floor. It wasn't a lifeless motion, it moved like something caught between the living and the dead, bound by a force that refused to release it. The traveler wanted to run, but his body wouldn't obey. Something unseen pressed down on him, a suffocating weight of cold dread that pinned him where he stood. The faint lullaby began again, soft and wavering, as though the figure was humming to itself. It was a tune that carried sorrow, yet something about it seemed familiar, like a melody sung to calm a frightened child. The traveler's mind scrambled to make sense of it. He realized he had heard that same tune faintly when he first approached the cabin, carried on the wind from deep in the woods. The song wasn't just a haunting echo, it was a call. He shined his light on the figure again, and for the briefest moment, he saw movement under the skin, a flicker, like the pulse of something still alive. His gaze dropped back to the box of rings. Beneath them, tucked into the dust, was a slip of parchment, stiff and brittle. He unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a marriage certificate, yellowed and faded, but the names were still visible, Elijah Hartman and Elsie Hartman. The date was the same as the one carved into the wall, the night Elijah had written about, the night the ritual took place. The truth crashed over him in a sickening wave. The figure before him wasn't Martha at all. It was Elsie, the child bride, preserved and displayed as both wife and offering. The bride had never left this place. She had been sealed here, her body turned into a monument to Elijah's madness. As he stood there, horror dawning in full, the lullaby stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then, from behind him, the faint sound of footsteps began, measured, deliberate, and unmistakably heavy. They descended the ladder he had climbed only moments ago. Dust rained from the beams above as the old boards groaned under each step. He turned, but his flashlight finally died, plunging the cellar into total darkness. In the blackness, a man's voice, deep and cracked with age, whispered the words that froze his blood completely. "You shouldn't have woken her." The traveler's heart stopped at the sound of that voice, low and gravelly, a sound that didn't belong to any living man. It carried the weight of time, thick with the echo of the earth itself, as if spoken from a place between life and death. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. His flashlight lay dead in his trembling hand, and the darkness around him seemed to pulse with movement. The air grew colder, and with each breath, he could see his own exhalation shimmer faintly in the pitch-black void. He took a cautious step backward, but the floor beneath him groaned as if warning him not to move. Then, from somewhere in that blackness, came the unmistakable sound of boots scraping slowly across stone. The footsteps weren't hurried, they were deliberate, steady, and getting closer. The traveler's voice trembled as he forced out a whisper, calling into the dark, asking who was there. No answer came. Only silence thick enough to drown in. Then, the faint glow of a lantern flickered to life a few feet away, its light weak but enough to illuminate the figure standing just beyond its reach. The man was tall, gaunt, and shrouded in the kind of stillness that made him seem less human than something remembered. His face was pale, almost gray, his eyes sunken and dark as if no light had touched them for years. Yet it wasn't the man's appearance that struck the traveler hardest, it was the recognition. He had seen that face before. The photograph in the locket. The portrait in the journal. Elijah Hartman was standing before him. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then Elijah spoke again, his voice cracked and soft, but each word cut through the cold like a blade. He said he had been waiting for the traveler, that the forest had led him here for a reason. His tone was not angry but mournful, filled with the kind of conviction only madness can give. He claimed that the cycle was broken when Elsie was taken from him, that her spirit had been restless ever since, searching for someone to complete what was begun. The traveler shook his head, backing away, but Elijah followed, the lantern's light flickering across the veil of the motionless figure behind him. He raised a trembling hand toward her and said, "She's still waiting for her vow." At that moment, the veil began to lift, slowly, as though an unseen wind was peeling it back. The lantern dimmed, the air grew impossibly cold, and the traveler felt the world tilt. A faint breath brushed against his ear, and a soft voice whispered the same word Elijah had spoken, vow, The traveler's body locked in place as the word vow rippled through the darkness, carrying a weight far greater than sound. It wasn't merely spoken, it was felt, vibrating through the air and into his chest like a pulse. The veil finished lifting, and the dim lantern light revealed what lay beneath. Elsie's face was pale, almost luminescent, her eyes open and glistening as though tears had never stopped forming. There was no decay, no lifelessness, only an unnatural stillness, as if she had been frozen between heartbeats. Her lips were parted slightly, whispering breath without sound, and her gaze was fixed not on Elijah, but on the traveler. He stumbled back, his foot catching on the uneven stone, nearly sending him crashing into the altar. Elijah's expression softened, a sick blend of pride and sorrow twisting his withered features. He reached out toward the traveler and said, "She's chosen you." The words hit like ice. The traveler stammered, asking what he meant, but Elijah continued, his voice rising with the rhythm of ritual, the cadence of belief. He spoke of bloodlines, of divine selection, of how the mountain never forgets what belongs to it. He said the vow was never meant to die with him, that a new vessel must always carry the bond forward. The traveler realized then that this encounter was no accident. The forest, the whispers, the old journal, all of it had been drawing him here, as if the land itself had guided him toward this cursed inheritance. Elsie moved. Just slightly at first, a turn of her head, the soft rustle of her dress. Her eyes followed him, their pale light reflecting the lantern's dying flame. He could feel her presence pressing closer, the air around him tightening with every breath. He wanted to run, to climb the ladder and escape into the cold night above, but something stronger held him still. It wasn't fear, it was the same pull Elijah had once written about, that strange, suffocating devotion. Elijah began to chant in a language that no longer belonged to any church, his cracked voice filling the cellar, the words echoing off the stone like prayers twisted into spells. The lantern flickered again, then went out completely. For a moment, everything was swallowed by darkness. Then came the sound, the gentle rustle of fabric moving closer, followed by the unmistakable touch of a cold hand brushing against the traveler's face. The voice returned, not from Elijah this time, but from within the darkness itself, whispering softly, almost tenderly, "Say the vow, and it will all end." The cellar felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The traveler stood frozen, the echo of that whispered command, "Say the vow, and it will all end," circling his mind like a spell he didn't dare speak aloud. He tried to move, but his body betrayed him, trembling under the weight of something unseen. Elijah's form was barely visible now, only the faint shimmer of his outline where the lantern had been. His voice came again, softer this time, almost pleading. He said the vow was not a curse but a blessing, the only way to keep her spirit at peace. He said the mountain demanded balance, that the bloodline could not be left broken. The traveler shook his head violently, trying to deny what was happening, but the voice, Elsie's voice, came again, closer now, brushing against his ear like breath. He could feel her there beside him even though he couldn't see her. The faint scent of old flowers filled the air, mingling with the smell of dust and damp earth. When he turned slightly, a glimmer caught his eye, the gold band he had seen earlier, lying on the floor where it must have fallen from the box. The locket beside it swung gently, as if stirred by an invisible hand. He took a hesitant step toward them, drawn by a force he didn't understand. His fingers brushed the ring, and the moment he touched it, a rush of images flooded his mind. He saw Elijah and Elsie beneath the moonlight, standing before a fire that cast long shadows on the trees. He saw her pale face, blank and hollow, as Elijah slid the same ring onto her trembling hand. He heard their voices merging into one, repeating words of devotion that sounded more like surrender. The vision snapped away, leaving him gasping. The cellar was silent again, but the pressure in the air grew unbearable. He realized that what Elijah had done wasn't merely symbolic, he had bound something eternal, a covenant that reached beyond the grave. And now, that vow was waiting to be renewed. Elijah's figure flickered in the dimness like smoke caught in light. His tone changed, less pleading, more commanding, as he repeated the same phrase, each time louder than before. "Say the vow." The traveler stumbled backward, but his heel struck something solid, the altar. The impact sent the box of rings scattering across the floor, the sound ringing out like tiny bells. The air turned icy, and then, through the darkness, Elsie's eyes appeared again, two pale orbs, unblinking, fixed on him. Her mouth moved slowly, shaping the same words her father had spoken, her voice and his overlapping into one haunting demand: say the vow, and join us forever. The traveler's breath came in shallow bursts, his chest tightening as the words "join us forever" seemed to echo from every direction. The air had grown so cold that his skin burned, his fingers numb and stiff as he reached blindly for something, anything, to hold onto. The cellar pulsed with a strange rhythm, like the slow beat of a heart buried beneath the earth. He could no longer tell where the sound came from, perhaps from the walls themselves, or from the thing that lingered just beyond the edge of his sight. Elijah's presence loomed closer, though the man's outline had become translucent, his body flickering like a dying flame. His voice, however, was steady and filled with eerie calm. He told the traveler that the mountain chose him because he carried the mark, that his arrival was no coincidence. He said the vow must continue, that only through him could Elsie awaken fully. The traveler tried to speak, to deny the words, but his voice came out as a choked whisper. He wanted to scream that he wasn't part of this, that he didn't belong to their blood, but even as the thought crossed his mind, he remembered the cut on his hand from earlier, the one he got when prying open the trapdoor. He looked down now and saw the faint shimmer of dried blood on his palm, glowing faintly in the dark. Elijah's eyes fixed on it, and his cracked lips curled into a satisfied smile. "She knows you," he murmured, his tone thick with reverence. "You've already been bound." The traveler's pulse quickened. The ground beneath him began to tremble, dust falling from the ceiling as the air hummed with unseen energy. He felt something tugging at him from within, like invisible threads pulling tight around his chest. Then, slowly, the figure of Elsie began to rise. Her movement was unnatural, too smooth, too fluid, as though gravity no longer had claim over her. Her veil floated around her face, and the pale glow of her eyes illuminated the shadows. She reached out a hand toward him, her expression sorrowful but unyielding, her lips moving in time with Elijah's chanting. He could hear them both now, voices intertwining in a dreadful harmony, the same words repeated over and over in a language older than prayer. He stumbled backward, pressing against the wall, but the stones were slick and cold. The whispering voices grew louder until they filled his head completely. His vision blurred, the world spinning. He felt Elsie's icy hand graze his cheek, and in that touch, he saw a flash of her memories, pain, isolation, a love twisted into madness. And then, somewhere deep inside the noise, her voice broke through, trembling and human, pleading rather than commanding. She whispered, "Please, don't let him do it again." The traveler's entire body went rigid as Elsie's whispered plea cut through the chaos. Her voice wasn't like before, it carried pain, desperation, and something heartbreakingly human. The chanting stopped. Elijah's expression changed, his eyes narrowing as though her words were knives twisting into his chest. The silence that followed was thick, trembling with a tension that seemed alive. Elsie's gaze flickered between them, her glow dimming slightly as if she were fighting to speak against something stronger holding her. The traveler realized, with dawning horror, that she wasn't trying to fulfill her father's vow, she was trying to escape it. She wanted freedom, not devotion. But Elijah, even in death, refused to let her go. His form began to flicker violently, the edges of his body unraveling into smoke, his voice cracking with fury. "You don't understand," Elijah hissed, his words breaking into distorted echoes. "She was born for this. She is mine, ours." His anger was a storm, shaking the air and rattling the cellar's stones. The traveler stumbled, covering his ears as the sound grew deafening, but Elsie's voice rose against it, clearer now, her tone soft but defiant. "I never wanted forever," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "You made me a ghost before I ever died." Her words seemed to wound him, his shadow shrinking against the far wall as cracks began to spread across the floor beneath them. The faint light that surrounded her grew brighter, pushing back the darkness inch by inch. The traveler could feel the mountain itself responding, the same rhythm that had pulsed through the walls now shifted, its heartbeat quickening. The air shimmered, and the ground beneath him split open slightly, revealing veins of faint blue light running through the stone. Elijah roared, his voice both human and monstrous, his face contorting into something that no longer belonged to the living. He lunged toward her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her face to the traveler, her eyes wide and imploring. "Break it," she whispered. End what he began. He didn't know what to do, but instinct drove him. His gaze darted to the altar, the box of rings, the carved words, the locket still lying open. The traveler grabbed the locket and hurled it against the stone, shattering the glass inside. A scream tore through the cellar, not from Elsie, but from Elijah. His figure convulsed, his form disintegrating into dust and smoke. The room shuddered violently as his presence was ripped away, leaving only the sound of wind rushing through the open trapdoor. When the dust settled, Elsie was gone too, the space where she had stood empty but peaceful, as though a burden centuries old had finally lifted. The silence that followed Elijah's disappearance was unlike anything the traveler had ever experienced. It wasn't relief, it was emptiness, deep and echoing, like the world itself had paused to breathe after centuries of holding its voice. Dust hung in the air, swirling slowly in the faint blue glow that still seeped through the cracks in the stone floor. The traveler's heart pounded in his chest, the only sound left in the quiet cellar. He called out softly, unsure if he expected an answer. There was none. The space where Elsie had stood moments ago was cold but calm, the air no longer thick with the weight of her presence. He knelt, his trembling hands brushing against the spot where her veil had fallen. It was real, delicate lace, frayed and yellowed with age, but still warm to the touch. He didn't understand how that could be. The faint smell of roses lingered in the air, soft and fleeting, and for a moment, he thought he heard her voice again, not a whisper this time, but a sigh, fading into the stillness. He wanted to believe she was finally free. He wanted to think her spirit had found rest after being bound for so long by her father's madness. But as he stood, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The symbols on the walls, the ones carved deep into the stone, were no longer glowing faintly as they had before. Instead, they were pulsing, faintly at first, then stronger, as if waking from sleep. The light wasn't blue anymore. It had turned a dull, burning red. The traveler took a step back, his mind racing. He had destroyed the locket, broken the object that anchored Elijah's spirit, but in doing so, he might have disturbed something deeper, something older. The ground trembled again, subtly this time, like the faint throb of something alive beneath his feet. A low hum began to fill the room, almost too soft to hear, but it grew steadily louder until it vibrated in his chest. He turned toward the ladder, desperate to leave, but when he grabbed the rungs, they felt warm, too warm, like the wood was being heated from within. A voice echoed faintly from above, distant and hollow. It sounded like a woman calling his name, though he had never told anyone he was coming here. He looked up toward the trapdoor, the faint light of the cabin filtering through. Then the hum stopped, replaced by a sudden stillness so complete it made his ears ring. He climbed quickly, his heart hammering, but as he pushed open the door and pulled himself into the cabin, he froze. The air smelled of smoke, and the walls were covered in symbols, freshly carved, still glistening as though written in blood. The traveler's stomach churned as he stepped into the cabin, his boots crunching on debris scattered across the floor. The familiar wood walls, once muted and weathered, now seemed alive, etched with symbols glowing faintly like embers in the gloom. He could feel them pulsing under his skin, a rhythm almost like a heartbeat, drawing him forward despite every instinct screaming to flee. The air was thick and suffocating, heavy with the scent of smoke, earth, and something far older, something primordial, lingering like a warning. As he moved toward the hearth, he noticed that the dust on the floor had shifted, forming patterns that looked deliberate, almost like footsteps that hadn't been there when he entered. The box of rings lay overturned, its contents scattered across the floor. He had thought the destruction of the locket and the altar in the cellar would end the curse, but the cabin told a different story. The rings glimmered faintly in the half-light, casting reflections that seemed to flicker unnaturally, twisting shadows across the walls. Then he heard it, a soft scrape from the corner of the room. He turned, heart hammering, to see the faint outline of a figure emerging from the shadows. It wasn't Elijah this time, nor Elsie, but someone, or something, moving with deliberate slowness, as if each step was measured and intentional. Its presence was almost imperceptible at first, but the traveler could feel the air vibrating around him, charged with unseen energy. A whisper brushed against his ear, unintelligible at first, a susurration that made his skin crawl. He spun, swinging the flashlight beam wildly, but the source remained elusive. The pulsing symbols on the walls seemed to react, glowing brighter, throbbing in rhythm with the voice that rose in volume, now forming words he could barely understand. They spoke of bloodlines, of vows, of a debt that had not been settled. The traveler felt the air shift as if the room itself were breathing, constricting around him with every inhalation. The warmth of the fireplace, once comforting, now felt like a trap, a circle of fire enclosing him in a space that refused escape. Then movement came from the far window, where the mist swirled outside like smoke. He saw the faintest silhouette, pale and barely discernible, standing among the trees. It didn't move closer, yet its presence pressed upon him like a tangible weight. He realized then that whatever had been bound in the mountains had not been destroyed, it had only shifted, waiting, watching. The whispers became louder, layered now with dozens of voices speaking at once, murmuring, pleading, and commanding. The traveler's hands shook, and his knees threatened to buckle under the realization he hadn't ended anything. He had awakened something older, something that had been lying dormant in the shadows of the cabin, patient and deliberate, waiting for the next step in a cycle that might never end. The traveler's mind raced as the whispers intensified, echoing from every corner of the cabin, layering into a dissonant chorus that made his head spin. Each voice carried fragments of warning, fragments of command, fragments of sorrow, all overlapping into a maddening symphony. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the scattered rings, and pressed himself against the wall, feeling the stone and wood vibrate beneath his palms as if the building itself were alive. The shadows seemed to stretch and pulse with every beat of the whispered voices, thickening and thinning in unnatural patterns, as though breathing in tandem with something unseen. A cold gust swept through the cabin, rattling the window panes and extinguishing what little light filtered in. The faint glow from the etched symbols on the walls grew stronger, now a harsh, almost acidic red, illuminating figures carved into the wood and stone that he hadn't noticed before. They weren't just abstract shapes, they were faces, twisted and mournful, frozen in expressions of terror, grief, and defiance. Some seemed to move as he shifted his gaze, their eyes following him with impossible intent. He realized with a shiver that these weren't mere carvings, they were impressions, echoes of those who had been bound, trapped by the same forces he now faced. The sound of footsteps came from above, soft and hesitant, and then another set, lighter, almost hesitant, as if something else was joining them. His eyes darted toward the ceiling, the trapdoor looming like a portal between the world above and this cursed place. The air grew heavier, pressing down on his shoulders and chest. He felt his breath shortening as though the cabin itself were suffocating him. And then, through the cacophony of whispers, a single voice rose above the rest, Elsie's, clear and trembling, yet unmistakable. It didn't call for him, nor did it plead, it commanded, urging him toward the far corner of the room where the altar had once stood. He approached cautiously, every instinct screaming to turn and flee, but the pulse of the air seemed to guide his steps. The scattered rings glimmered faintly, as though each one held a fragment of memory, a shard of devotion or madness preserved over time. His hand hovered over one, the gold band cold to the touch despite the warmth in the room, and he realized the truth, the cycle hadn't been broken. The ritual, the vows, the obsession, all of it was layered, trapped in the very walls, waiting for someone to awaken it again. And now, by entering this place, by disturbing the remnants of the altar, he had become part of it. The whispers coalesced into a singular, growing chant, enveloping him, suffocating him, binding him with the same unseen chains that had held the mountain's secrets for generations. The traveler's vision blurred as the chant rose in intensity, filling every corner of the cabin, reverberating through his chest like a drumbeat from the earth itself. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with light and shadow, the carved faces on the wood and stone writhing as if alive. He stumbled backward, barely catching himself against the splintered table, his heart hammering in his ears. Each whisper, each echo of a past vow, pressed against his mind, threatening to overwhelm him completely. The air was thick, almost viscous, as though he were moving through water, each step laborious, each breath a struggle. The cabin no longer felt like a building, it felt like a vessel, a conduit for centuries of obsession, waiting to spill its secrets on anyone foolish enough to enter. He could feel something coiling around his ankles, invisible yet undeniably present, tugging him toward the far corner of the room where the altar once stood. His hands shook as he reached out, brushing against the cold stone floor. There, he saw it, the faint outline of a circle carved into the wood, hidden beneath decades of dust and detritus. Symbols and runes swirled within it, glowing faintly, reacting to his presence as if aware he had arrived. The rings lay scattered inside the circle, glimmering faintly under the pulse of the supernatural light. He understood, with a sick clarity, that this was the heart of it all, the center of Elijah's madness, the focal point of the ritual that had bound Elsie and twisted the forest itself. The whispers shifted, no longer a chorus but a single, insistent voice calling directly to him, urging him to complete what had been started. He realized that everything, Elijah, Elsie, the trapdoor, the journal, had been leading him here, shaping him into the next participant in a cycle that had endured for generations. The cold brush of unseen hands against his arms made him flinch, and he stumbled into the circle, the carvings beneath his feet vibrating faintly. The air tightened, pressing against his lungs, and the hum of the mountain rose to a deafening pitch. Then, suddenly, it all stopped. The light dimmed to a pale glow, the whispers faded, and the hands vanished. He stood alone in the cabin, shaking, sweat and cold mingling on his skin. For a moment, he thought it was over, that he had survived whatever haunted the mountains. But the circle beneath him pulsed one final time, faint and deliberate, a heartbeat that whispered a single word through the silence, unfinished. The traveler understood then that the story wasn't over, not for him, not for the mountains, and certainly not for Elsie. The traveler's knees buckled as the single word unfinished echoed in his mind, heavy and resonant. He staggered backward, the weight of the cabin pressing down on him like a living entity. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward him, curling along the walls, the floor, and ceiling as though the room itself were aware of his presence. The air smelled sharp, metallic, and sweet at once, carrying the ghostly scent of flowers and decay. He could feel the pulse of the circle beneath him, a rhythm like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, reminding him that the force he had awakened was far from dormant. The cabin was no longer just a structure of wood and stone, it was the body of Elijah's obsession, a vessel that had held generations of devotion, madness, and secrets, waiting for the next unwitting participant to enter its grasp. He turned toward the trapdoor, the ladder that had led him into this nightmare, but the shadows seemed to pulse between him and the exit, elongating and twisting like fingers meant to trap him. The scattered rings from the altar glimmered faintly, reflecting a light that seemed to come from nowhere, each one holding fragments of memory, of vows, of lives consumed by the same ritualistic madness. He realized that these were not merely objects, they were anchors, remnants of a cycle that had repeated endlessly in the mountains. The whispering voices returned, soft at first, almost pleading, then louder, layered over one another. They spoke of Elsie, of the vow, of obligations that spanned generations, and of bloodlines that could not be broken. The traveler's mind raced. Every instinct screamed to flee, to escape the cabin, to leave the mountains behind forever, but something deeper, primal, urged him to stay. The pulse beneath his feet grew faster, vibrating through his bones, syncing with his own heartbeat. He stumbled, falling to his hands and knees, and in that moment, the air shifted again. A cold, almost tangible presence brushed against him, moving with purpose, circling him, reminding him that he was not alone. He looked up into the darkness, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw her, Elsie, her pale form hovering just beyond the glow of the symbols, her eyes wide and sorrowful. The cabin shuddered violently, dust and debris raining from the ceiling. The whispering voices crescendoed into a chorus, demanding, pleading, warning. The traveler realized with dawning terror that he had not escaped, that nothing he had done had broken the cycle. He was caught, a living part of the legacy Elijah had begun. The pulse of the circle beneath him quickened, and the symbols on the walls glowed brighter than ever. As the cabin seemed to inhale around him, he understood that the mountain secrets, the vows, and the bound spirits were not finished, they were only beginning anew, and now, he was a part of them, entwined with a story that had no end.